Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Film Field NFL. This is the first episode officially that we're doing of this series. It's a series I started maybe about a year and a half ago. It's a series just generally talking about the NFL, but this year we wanted to decide to expand on that, doing draft coverage, off-season coverage, general summer scouting, as well as talking about the regular season. So if you're not familiar with me, I'm Jack. I've been doing this for about 2 years now, but it's been a very on and off thing. I'm someone who's always been into the NFL, but we've especially wanted to start covering it on a more heavy basis this year. So I want to talk a little bit about what's going to be happening in the next couple of weeks in regards to the content that's going to be coming out on this page. Now, if you already follow me, you're probably familiar with a little bit of what I already do, which is on the side, screenwriting, comic book content, all that stuff. But also as well, we're very interested in football and just general football coverage. So you'll be seeing a lot more of that going on, especially with draft week being this week, which is pretty crazy to think about. We have a lot of videos coming out that's going to be going over general mock drafts, where we think guys are going to be drafted, general grades for a lot of these players. So far, I've graded about 110 players myself, so it's definitely been a grind the past couple of weeks, but I want to get especially into the specific videos you'll be seeing this week. So right off the bat, expect on Monday for us to do a mock draft review. We'll be going over our own individual mock drafts that we've done. It's going to be me and two others. That'll be Q and Shane, and we'll basically be comparing our mock drafts and seeing where we value certain guys to be going, if they're going a little bit later in the draft, earlier. I definitely have my hot takes, that's for sure. But we'll be comparing those and seeing kind of where our headspace is at, seeing where we value certain guys. Like off the bat, I can tell you, I'm definitely somebody who's going to be valuing the receivers in this draft a lot more than other people. But in general, that will be what that video will be about. And just generally talking about all of those players that we expect to be going in that first round. After that, I would say expect a bit of coverage of just the upcoming days of the draft, little bits of information we're hearing. There might be some solo videos by me, either doing all 22 breakdown of certain players or just in general talking about what I expect to happen with the draft. Because I think a big problem of what ends up happening with the draft is whenever it comes to the later round guys, when you're talking about third, fourth, fifth round guys, whenever people have a strong take on a player, they tend to throw that out there, and then next year they don't come back to it ever again. It's usually just kind of over there. They never, look back at their grades and see where did they go wrong. That's a problem, because at that point, no one's ever taking what they went wrong with the year before and trying to learn from it. That's the biggest problem that I have when it comes to draft coverage. And that's something that I don't want us to do. I think every single year, I would say even every couple of months, I want to keep looking back at a lot of these draft grades that we gave out and seeing what was the process, what did we value traits-wise, what did we value production-wise, analytically, and where did we fail? Because there's a lot of times that I fail. For me, I primarily cover receivers, so for me, that's what I try to look at in terms of my process of where I go wrong and right. When it comes to quarterback, it's the same thing, but obviously I think quarterback's a lot more volatile in regards to the sport. And so that's going to be differing every year, especially for this year, which is a draft with a very weak quarterback class. So with that being said, I want to start getting into a few guides and just general my opinions about this upcoming draft. So let's get into it. So right off the bat, I kind of want to talk about the general strength of this class. I think most people can agree by this point that this is a weaker class. Where I tend to fight back on this is when people call it a bad class. There aren't really bad classes anymore. We really haven't seen that in a while. Now you at least get role players, developmental guys, guys that can be 2s and 3s on your team, and that is unbelievably valuable in this day and age. When we see so many hybrid defenses, hybrid offenses that use their players in weird ways, the idea that as soon as you don't have a blue chip elite player on the board, whether it's receiver or edge rusher or quarterback, that you just don't have much value in the draft, I push back on that because I don't think that's true. As much as I love this receiver class, for example, there's a lot of depth in day 2, somewhat day 3, but specifically day 2. Those rounds 2 and 3, there are so many slot receivers, developmental X guys, slashers that I think that are great, that people are going to take chances on when they decide to not take a receiver in the first round. And that's important because that's showing you where the value is at. It's not even just about this is a weaker class and maybe they don't want to, maybe they don't value Carnell Tate as highly as some other people do. It's not really about that. It's about the fact of, well, if I know I can get a edge rusher that I think is high level in the first round, then I know that there is an abundance of second round slot receivers that I know I'm in the, market to look for. That's what I'm going to wait for, right? And that's what a lot of this class is teams wondering, what is my best value here, right? Do I want to take Francis Mauigoa at 5, or would I rather just take one of these guards that I think is about, pretty similar to his grade that I can get on day 2 in the beginning of round 2, right? I feel that way about a lot of guys like Blake Miller. Like, a lot of these tackles in this class are guys that I view as probably guards going into the league. And so when you look at it through that lens, especially for me, I'm a Giants fan, you see a lot of talk about Francis Mauigoa at 5, right? Is that what the Giants are going to do? I would push back against that, because for me, I'm looking at the value of it as, well, you could get a Blake Miller in the beginning of round 2. You could get a Kalen Rutledge or something like that, right? These are players that I don't think are that far off from a guy like Mauigoa. The only guy here that I think is a solidified guard, and I say that like strongly, solidified guard, because I don't think there's a single solidified tackle in this class that I genuinely look at as perfectly translating to be a tackle. Like, I think Fano comes the closest, and even at that, there's part of me that thinks he should be a guard. But the only guy that I think is the most complete player at a certain position is Vega Ioane. He's the only one that truly feels like I can't poke that many holes in his game when it comes to being a guard. I don't think in any world I'd want him to be a tackle, but even these guys that I'm talking about that are tackles that I prefer to be guards, like Blake Miller and Spencer Fano and Mauigoa, like, I don't even talk about Mauigoa as a tackle. He is absolutely a guard to me. Regardless of that, those guys even playing guard, it's a little bit shaky. You wonder how that translation will be. I don't feel that way about Vega, right? So I ask myself, unless I'm getting like Vega and I'm feeling so confident about that, I don't really care about taking Mauigoa at 5 as opposed to just a Blake Miller in the beginning of round 2. So that's where these value conversations come in. And I think that's what's going to make this draft very unexpected. I think there's going to be a lot of moves people are not going to be expecting. I think that kind of applies to this edge group. I tend to have some pretty hot takes about this edge group. I don't love it overall at the top, but it's kind of how I feel about the tackle class, where it's like in round 2, though, there's a few guys that are developmental, a few guys that are high traits, high floor, that I would absolutely take a chance on. And even guys then that, even if I feel like they should transition to guard, I would much rather feel comfortable taking these guys at the end of round 2 and trying them out at tackle than trying one of these guys I'm a little bit scared of playing tackle at like pick 5 in the first round, right? So that's going to be where so many of these crazy either reaches or falls are going to happen for a lot of these players, because we're not really seeing it eye to eye with the NFL. That's why we're seeing so many of these, risers and fallers, even though the reality is most draft boards by these NFL teams, they stay the same. They don't really change that much. It's just us picking up more information. So with all that being said, I think there's going to be a lot of drastic differing opinions between teams. That's going to make it really look like a lot of draft analysts are getting a lot of these grades wrong. That doesn't mean everyone's wrong, but that means there's going to be a lot of variety in the way that they see things, right? Keldrick Falk is a great example. I don't know what's going to happen with a player like that. That's a player that I'm a little bit lower on. That's a player that I think ultimately has great length and is a very developmental edge rusher, but a guy that I see win more inside on guards than he does outside, playing truly as an edge rusher. And when it comes to those things, our team's going to value those high-end traits, because there's not a lot of guys that are necessarily put together high-end blue chip edge rushers in this class. Is he going to go in the middle of the first round because they're like, screw it? This is a guy that we can believe that is a Mykel Williams type, where maybe in 3 years, we're talking about this guy getting another contract, right? Maybe those first 2 years, not a lot's happening, but when it comes to that 3rd or 4th year, you're going to be saying sorry for calling him a bust, right? I think a lot of teams think about that when it comes to these high athletic trait edge rushers. I don't know how that will really ultimately go in this draft, because they might say, listen, Malachi Lawrence, he has a deeper bag than some of these other guys. Zion Young, I like the way he pushes the pocket. Like, I like the way this guy plays. I'm just going to take one of these guys at the end of the 2nd round, and I'll see if Keldrick Falk falls to the 3rd or the 2nd or something like that. That's kind of where I'm at with Keldrick Falk and the way that teams are going to evaluate traits in this class, because some are going to evaluate it to be way higher necessity, and some are going to say, I don't really care about this because there's a guy that rushes the passer way better than you, and he's nowhere near as strong as you. He doesn't have the physical frame that you do. And at this point, why wouldn't I take him? I think it's the reason Akeem Messidor is going to go so high despite his age, because they're going to say, screw it. This guy has a better pass rush bag than you. I'm going to take him. So All those things in consideration is why I think this will be one of the most interesting drafts we've ever had, because there is so much variety to what can happen. Obviously, beyond what I think are considered the top 5 guys, I think after that it gets a little bit shaky. For me, my highest graded player in this class is Arvell Reese because of the insane upside of this player, beyond the fact of just how elite of an athlete he is. I think he's unbelievable in terms of coverage. I think sometimes he can have some moments where it's a bit awkward. I think the upside of him ultimately is that you hope he can be a tweener type, right? And that his first season's a little bit like a Micah Parsons light. And I think that that's possible for him. If you ever heard him talk to Ben Solak recently, he talked about the fact that he was kind of freestyling it out there whenever he was out on the edge, right? He didn't really know what he was doing. A lot of that was just made up moves. And if that's the floor level of what we're expecting for Reese, who still had his moments, doing pretty good, rushing the passer. Again, it was far and few between, but it was there. If that's the case for Reese, you are thinking skyrocket high for ceiling, right? And he's already shown that the athletic traits are there to build upon that foundation. And a lot of these teams, they believe that that's all there. A lot of the David Bailey number 2 to the Jets hype that happened, I wasn't really buying because of how most of the league views Reese, which is unbelievably high if you can't tell. And when it comes to Bailey, I'm going to leave this conversation of Bailey more to when we get to the mock draft itself, because if you can't tell by some of my TikTok and YouTube shorts, I'm lower on Bailey than other people. That doesn't mean I'm second round low, but it does mean that I am lower in the sense that I think he's more of a top 15, top 20 player in this class than I do think that he is a player that I would take number 2. I would absolutely not take him number 2. That would be a disaster, in my opinion. That is where I think that a guy like Reese slots in. Now, with that being said, I've said before, I don't think it's a very strong edge class. Bane's my number 1 edge. I'm not going to say who my number 2 edge is because it's a pretty hot take, and I want to save that take for the draft video we do on Monday. But it's somebody that will definitely probably get some backlash. But I definitely don't view this to be a very high-level edge class. So again, it comes back to the conversation of value. Bailey at 2 is the antithesis of value, in my opinion. A guy like Bailey should be in the top 20s, and by that point, if you're viewing all that high speed to power stuff and the traits that he brings, take one of these developmental edges at that point. I just don't understand the thought process of thinking a guy like that should go 2. I get it, he was productive, he had a great slate of teams that he played, but in general, when I look at a lot of the play of edge rushers versus tackles in this class, there wasn't a lot of high-level tackle play that a lot of these guys were facing in general. So then that comes into question, too, about how good are these edge rushers really, right? It's a big gamble, and I'm not taking that gamble on a guy that I don't think has great bend in his ankles, a guy that doesn't have a lot of power, a guy that struggles with hand fighting. At a point, the speed-to-power thing cannot be your only push for him being a top 2 player in this class, and it's just, that's not the case for me. Like I said, Arvell Reese is my number 1 in this class. I think the upside is through the roof there. For me, number 2 is probably going to be Caleb Downs. I think that's most people's. And obviously, when it comes to the conversation of how high do you take a safety like that, I tend to be on the more new gen side of this, which is being super pro. Who cares? He's a really elite blue chip player. Take him high. But the conversation of value is going to be there when it comes to safety, especially with the rise of Dylan Thieneman. Now, to keep the record straight, I do not think Thieneman is even close to Downs as a prospect. But I like Thieneman a lot. I think in a normal draft, it would make sense for Thieneman to go decently high and be a, very loved first round pick. But for him to even be in the conversation with Caleb Downs, I just can't get there yet. And I'll talk more in depth as to why when we get to the mock draft video, but I just want to give an idea of where my headspace is at with this class. Now, when it comes to the receiver class, I want to talk about that a little bit more because I am very high on this receiver class. If you don't know the way that I tier off receivers, I've talked about it a few times. Basically, tier 1 is reserved for those Jamar Chase, Rome Odunze, Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, that tier of guys. Next tier, you can probably imagine Jeremiah Smith's going to hit that tier, right? Tier 2 is for the, not blue chip, but pseudo blue chip guys where it's like, you're not there, but you're close, right? Green chip, if you will. And for me, that's guys like JSN. He's at the top of that tier. Tetairoa McMillan last year. Brian Thomas Jr. This year for me, that's Carnell Tate. And along with Carnell Tate is 3 other receivers I put in tier 2, which is not something I do a lot at all. For reference, last year I had 1 tier 1 receiver, and then I had 2 tier 2 receivers, and then I had 2 tier 3 receivers. Tier 3 is like back half of the first round, late first round. If you're a tier 4 receiver to me, you're like a definitely going in the second round kind of guy. If you're tier 3, it's like you could fall to the second round, but I would take that guy around the like 28 to 31 range, right? But last year, for example, I had Travis Hunter as my wide receiver 1. And obviously, that's a whole other conversation about his usage and all that kind of stuff. But I believed him to be a tier 1 receiver. I truly believe that in my heart. Now, outside of that, I had Tetairoa McMillan and Luther Burden in my tier 2. Those are that JSN, BTJ type of range to me. And then after that, tier 3 was Matthew Golden and Emeka Egbuka, right? So you can kind of get a frame of reference of where I'm at with these things. For example, 2023, I had Jordan Addison, I had Zay Flowers in my tier 3, so you can get an idea of what that tier 3 looks like to me. This year, I've got 4 tier 2 guys. That's a lot. That's a lot of high-end guys that I view to be in this class. And then after that, I have 2 tier 3 guys. So that's 6 first-round receivers. That's not something I really expected for this class to be the case. And I'm going to kind of go over vaguely what that is to me. I have Carnell Tate as my 1. I don't want to get too into who's my 2 yet, but it's not Tyson or Lemon, even though I do love both those players. But those guys all to me are tier 2 players. I think they're flawed, not as great as Carnell Tate is, but I do think that they bring a lot to the table that makes me think they can either survive as a wide receiver 1 or be a great superstar 2, an elite superstar 2. You know what I mean? Something in the vein of a Devonta Smith, right? And so for me, I view this wide receiver class as very high end, but what's interesting about it is it also has a lot of depth. It's a receiver class that has tons and tons of depth with guys like Dejon Stribling in the 2nd, Ted Hurst maybe in the 3rd. You've got great slot receivers like Deion Burks, Antonio Williams. There's developmental upside guys like Chris Bell, Chris Brazel, if that's kind of your taste. There's a lot of guys here that are either developmental, high floor, low ceiling slot type of players, or just like boomer bust slasher flanker type guys. And I think that when you have that kind of a crowded room, I can see why a lot of teams might think to move to the second round to take a receiver. The reality to me is, as much as I like this class, outside of the first round, there is a drop-off. There is a drop-off. I think a lot of times when we talk about receiver, we tend to talk about it in this vein of like, oh, we'll wait till the second because it's always an abundance of receivers. Puka Nacua went in the 5th. Look how great he is. Yeah, a Puka Nacua is not a common thing, man. Like, that's just not something you're finding every year, and clearly it's an anomaly. So you can't just bet on that being the case if you decide to go with some mediocre guard in the first round, right? And especially when it comes to this receiver class, I think all 6 guys are going to go in the first round. I think there are receiver needy teams. I think there are wide receiver 2 needy teams that are going to say, you know, if Omar Cooper's there at the end of the first, I'm taking him, right? If Denzel Boston's there, I think the Buffalo Bills like him, right? If any of those guys slip to the second round, that is an absolute gem. But after that point, there is a drop-off to me. Because at that point, it's not like you're finding another superstar 2 unless you think you're developing a Chris Bell, or you think in the long run maybe a Chris Brazel could be something for you. After that, it's Antonio Williams, which is like a mostly only slot guy to me. There's, you know, guys like Dejon Stribling, which I think is a boomer bust candidate. There's a Hurst in the 3rd round, but that's not even a guy I think I potentially consider in the 2nd, right? There's a lot of range after that where you're not just looking at like an Omar Cooper, Denzel Boston type where you're like, oh, cool. In the 2nd round, I found myself a superstar 2. Let's see how this guy develops. It's like, no, after the drop off after Boston and Cooper, it's maybe 3s, it's maybe 4s in terms of deployment for some of these guys, right? So a team like the Raiders is a team that I hope can maybe find somebody because they are severely lacking in receiver. And it's not like you're just going to be able to fill in that hole with Antonio Williams, at least in my eyes. Maybe I'll be wrong, but I think there is a drop off after that point that teams that are trying to convince themselves they can just casually find somebody in the 2nd. Not sure how confident I am in that strategy, but we'll ultimately see. And I think a lot of that even is outside of their control because I think in a lot of normal drafts, maybe guys like Cooper and Boston slip to the 2nd, but this isn't a normal draft. I think this is a draft where you're going to see those guys potentially go pretty high. I just can't imagine any of the top 6 receivers really leaving the first round, at least in my eyes. And that's going to be definitely something we talk about a lot on the mock draft on Monday because I have a lot of thoughts about where these guys will end up and teams that are really clamoring for that wide receiver 2 superstar, right? Saints, Commanders, that whole ordeal. So we'll get into that on Monday. But yeah, I think in terms of this class as a whole, there's a lot of interesting variables going on where a lot of it's going to be incredibly hard to predict. I've seen so many mock drafts having the most random edge sixes, hitting like number 32, 31, 30. And that's what we might see. Like Zion Young wasn't really in these conversations to be a first round pick like a month ago, but now he is. Same thing with Malachi Lawrence. Like we're having conversations about the second round starting off with Derek Moore and Barsham. Like there's a lot of these guys that have become fast risers, at least in terms of the way that we're seeing how teams are looking at the board. That's going to change a lot of what we expect to happen. And when that happens, is there going to be on a run on tackles? Are a lot of teams going to wait till the second? Is that when we're going to see the run on tackles? A lot of that is going to be so up to so many variables that it's really hard to predict. So a lot of the process of what our mock draft is going to look like on Monday is comparing where we grade these players and then evaluating that to where we see teams, maybe their mindset being, what they typically draft in terms of, does this team like to look more so at traits? Are they a team that likes, more physical press corners? Like, what are they specifically looking at? And so that's what I'm very excited to get into, because I think when it comes to football, there's a lot of variance in the way that we view a certain player and how we view their deployment and how much snaps they're going to be looking at in general. And that's going to be very different for this draft. Like I said, for a class that a lot of teams look at as weaker, not bad, but weaker. So you're going to see a lot of reaches happen. And I'm excited to talk about that. So yeah, I want to leave this video at that. I want it to be a nice introductory of what this channel is going to look like and what we're going to be talking about, because I think this is probably the weirdest draft to be starting off with to have conversations about. But I think it'll be the most exciting. So with that being said, let's get out of here. Thank you so much, you guys, for watching this video. Like I said, be on the lookout for Monday. That mock draft is coming later in the day. And then afterwards, I'll be making some solo videos, probably going over some tape and just talking about some of my guys for day 3, day 2, things like that. And we will be extensively covering the draft on draft day throughout the week. Be on the lookout for that. And yeah, we'll be seeing you guys soon. Thank you so much.